This is dealing with Bloomberg chronological problems that are found. The reason why this issue is addressed is because some scholars have a problem with the chronological order of the different Gospels aligning with each other. Basically, um, the account of Matthew and the feeding of the 5,000. After that, he speaks about another event, whereas like in John or Mark, he might speak about a different event. So like right after that, he might start talking about a parable of Jesus. But the other ones might be kind of different parable. That's the type of problems they're talking about. It's not sequential. It's not one event after the other in perfect order in all the Gospels. They see a lot of differences going on in there. And so, because of those differences, they do not place historical value. That's the words Blomberg used, was like historical value. They do not see the historical value of it because of these chronological problems. I see that as a side issue more so if you're talking about historical value. Because chronological problems in these four accounts doesn't really mean that they're not right. It just doesn't mean that they're being told in the same order. I find that very harsh criticism for the historical accuracy of the Bible, particularly the New Testament Gospels, because we see repeatedly, especially in Luke, mention and names of different officials of that time, eyewitness corroborations, early church father, late church fathers, many people who continue on with this, and something that they truly believe happened. The conversion of Paul and his own self-confession of it, of his changed attitude and heart, and how he corroborated the account and it's written in Acts. There's a lot of huge testimonies that we can actually verify. So it's very, very, very big to say that it's historically inaccurate just because of chronological problems. But that's just a side note. To actually address that question, Blomberg points out that the type of lettering system they used in the Greek did not mean that it was actually one after the other. Like when they use the word and or then, it doesn't mean immediately right afterwards. They could be referring to like an entirely different story all of a sudden. So we talk about the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. And then we're going to switch over to the parable of the tenants. But it doesn't mean that there's a chronological, like it doesn't mean that it's in an order. The different Gospels were talking to a different culture, and there were different messages and portraying different aspects of Christ. If they were all the same and written in the same account and in the same order as each other, that would point, why would be the reason of writing them? If they were all the same in the same order, repeating the same things, there would be no need for more than a gospel. There would only be need for one gospel if they're all writing the same thing. So they'd be just repeating the same thing, but they're not. They're teaching different things with different emphases and different tones that we can pick up on it in the different books. Matthew portrays God as the Messiah to the Jews, so he focuses a lot more on prophecy. Luke is portraying him as a man to the Greeks, so he focuses more on Christ's humanity. They use a lot of the same stories, but they also have some differences. But that doesn't mean those chronological differences make them inaccurate. It just means they choose to tell the story in a different way. It isn't strictly saying that this is in chronological order. The Gospels never make that claim. But what chronological order you do see is the very structured baptism of Jesus, and also in his death. Those are completely the same throughout. They speak on almost the same message. John emphasizes a lot more on the last days of Jesus' ministry before his death, but they all had the same sequence of events, in his death and his resurrection, that he ascended, and like the according of events, especially in his death. The Last Supper, entering Jerusalem, the events of Gethsemane, his death, the different trials that he went to, those are all matching up, and those are the really biggies. Like the problem that they were mostly seeing would be in the middle of Jesus' ministry. The beginning of Jesus' ministry, it was with John the Baptist. That always corroborates, and like the first few trials before Jesus began his ministry, those always corroborate. There's no differences about that. They might omit them in some texts, but that's because they're written in other texts. So, especially like John. John knew that other texts were written. He wrote his 35 years later. So his is very different than the other three, because he was making entirely different points that people were missing in his gap. Another thing would be you can't take off historical value just because you see chronologicalness, some mixed upness. You can also say there's a lot of truth in the Gospels. There's so much that corroborates. There's so much that is similar in these. There's so much that is connected that it's really hard to say that point with an actual real emphasis on that, because when you look at them, they may be telling the same stories and they have a slight different like tone, but they are very similar. They all are very, very, very similar. It's hard to say that, like, I don't know how to phrase it, but the Gospels, their differences are minute enough to not be a huge problem, but they're big enough so that you can see that they are different and they have different emphases on what they're speaking about. Another thing, and also, why refute historical accuracy now, 2,000 years later? That was one of my biggest issues when I read this. That scholars have not been questioning this. Earlier scholars have been just going with it, writing on it, and they have been arguing over different points. But one of their bigger things was not chronological order at all. This is very much a modern thing, but that we've only been seeing within the past 100 years. So I find that a very big and condemning one against this, that they would bring it up almost 2,000 years after the fact. What about the other 1,900 years of scholars that have been studying the Bible and evaluating it? They were much closer to the days, especially than the first 300. They were much closer to the day. We don't see that issue being raised. And now we see it being raised by people who are far from the event. The event is far enough away that we can't actually discern a clear answer for this. But I think we can discern it clear enough to say that this isn't an issue. But we can't go to the MT of just going down to it. But so distance helps. It's like with evolution. Add another billion years and it all makes sense. So that is one factor against it. They had a vast amount of teaching in John. The Gospels did, but their stories are very similar. They chose a lot of the same stories. In John, he talks about the very ending, and if they tried to write all the accounts, then there wouldn't be enough books in all the world to write about what Jesus did. That is astonishing in and of itself. There's so much material, the cover, and they chose so much of the similar stories with different emphases so people would be familiar with it. Also, one of the big differences I want to point out, like chronological wise, like some stories they include and some stories they didn't include. My biggest thing for this is the story of Lazarus. Jesus raised a man 4 days after he died, and in front of a ton of witnesses, religious leaders. That is a huge proof. That is something you want everybody to know. And then like they can be like, really, this happened? But the Synoptic Gospels do not mention this at all. It's only in John. And I'm like, why? That is such a great proof of the deity of God and of his supremacy. That shows, look at this miracle bringer. Like he performed so many amazing miracles, but I'd say raising from the dead is in the category of and of itself. So why didn't they record it? I think it's because, this is my personal opinion, is because Lazarus was either still alive at that time or his story was so widely known because it was such an impressive event that they didn't need to record it because the audiences that they were writing to already knew of this event. The reason why John had to write it is because he wrote it like 40 years later. So he wrote it because people would not be as familiar with the event of Lazarus raising, or he wanted to make sure people remembered this and that it was carried on in a non-apocryphal form or by any other writing, but by an actual disciple of Jesus. That is also a thing. Eyewitness accounts. These are eyewitness accounts. 4 eyewitness accounts, or taken from a bunch of eyewitness accounts. So many people, so many saw this. The book of Acts, so many people. In Jerusalem, the tongues of flame, 3,000 people converted that day. 3,000 converted. How many more people just saw that, but they could testify to it? And when Jesus rose from the dead, he showed himself to many people. And you don't see the religious leaders refuting that. You see what the religious leaders are refuting in the Gospels and in historical accounts is that the disciples stole his body. They never say that his body was still there. They say his body's missing. So they acknowledge that Jesus was not in the tomb anymore, but they say the disciples took it. There's a lot of historical accuracies here. Chronological problems I do not see as one of the bigger issues. I don't see as much ground for it because, like, also they didn't have chapter and verses when they first wrote this. That was added a lot later on. Chapter and verses came on, so it was just one big mass text in these scrolls. So just a continuous stream. So it wasn't broken up into nice little pockets that we have now in our new Bibles. It was all rolled into one. So events that we wouldn't see as linked were linked, and events we see as linked were not linked. If that makes some sense. So the way we view it isn't quite correct. Like you should, yeah, exactly. chronological or error is not as big of an issue as we think. I'm losing my thoughts here. Yeah. They didn't have the markers. They didn't have the verse in the chapters. That, to me, shows me that it could have been all continuously mushed together, and they're just drawing on different parables to make their points, or different parables, because I'm sure many people in those days had heard the stories of Jesus, so they were choosing the ones that best fit for what they wanted to talk about. And I think it's very interesting they all pick a lot of similar stories. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, synoptic, they're so synonymous. They have a lot of the same material, and I find that so interesting that when John says there's so much material that they couldn't feed all the books in the world, so they all chose so much similar material. There's a lot more similarities than there are differences. I don't see the chronological problem as being a big issue because it's in Jesus' ministry. It's in the middle. It's in the clump. And the clump is they're just relating stories that Jesus told during his ministry. It's not trying to be in order. If they made that claim, then this would be a valid argument. But they never make that claim. They're just saying this is what happened during Jesus' 3-year ministry. They name the places where he said it. They name the places that he traveled, and those are real places, and you can corroborate that. But in order of a timeline, it's a lot harder to name that. And there are different discrepancies if you try looking at a timeline. But I want to go back. Just keep in mind that the Greek text has slightly different meaning and flow of time. They weren't like repeating like this happened and then after that this happened. They weren't doing specific dates. They were reciting events that happened, and they wanted to back up that the events actually happened. Not that they happened in a certain order, but that the events happened. So I see that as a great argument for biblical historical accuracy, is that they can't argue that the events did not happen, but they have to argue that the order of the events is incorrect. And that is what I have to say about Blomberg's historical chronological problems on page 169 to page 171. No, 168 to 171. Okay. Thank you.